Now, I'm not saying that separatists or nationalists are good or bad by nature. Maybe in some countries, it's people's, demands to separate. Well, I mean, that would be fine, right? But in the case of Iraq in particular, Iraqis in general are against separation. The polls that were conducted in Iraq during the last years, until the latest poll that was conducted 2 weeks ago, shows that 3/4 of the Iraqi population are against separation. They are for having a central government. Now, this is taking in part, in consideration the specificity of the Kurds in the north and Kurdistan. We're talking about Sunnistan and Shiastan. Now, more importantly than the polls is what's happening inside the Iraqi government itself. It's one huge conflict, huge political and economic conflict that is happening inside the Iraqi government that no one talks about in the US. Now, what's this conflict is that Iraqis had general elections, you remember, in 2005, the purple finger. And I'm one of the millions of Iraqis who actually voted in the elections. People, do you know who did people vote for? I mean, which branch of the government did Iraqis vote for in that elections? Which one? I mean, like in the US, like in the US, people vote for the Congress, for the legislative branch, and they vote for the executive branch, for the president. Or at least this is what they're supposed to do. But in Iraq, what did they do? For the parliament, because Iraq is a parliamentarian system, right? So now, Iraqis voted for the parliament, and no one voted for the executive branch. The executive branch is supposed to be created out of the parliament. Now, where we stand now, the five parties, the five Sunnis and Shiites and Kurds, who lost the elections, they have 120 or 130 seats. They control the executive branch exclusively. The only five parties in the executive branch are the five parties who actually lost the elections. The 12 parties that won the elections, that control 140 to 150 seats of the parliament. The parliament has 275 seats, so anyone who controls more than 138 controls the majority. So the 12 parties that control the majority have zero representation in the executive branch. Now, this can't happen in a country like in a parliamentarian system, because no one voted for the executive branch. How can it happen, that a minority of parliamentarians, minority of groups in the parliament, end up ruling the country exclusively? I'll tell you how it can happen. You should have 150,000 occupation troops and 150,000 private contractors, and that can happen. It's magic. By magic, the five Sunnis and Shiites and Kurds, two Shiites, one Sunni, and two Kurdish parties, these five, who met with the Bush administration in 2002 in London to prepare for the invasion and justify it, by magic, even after they lost the elections, they ended up alone in the executive branch. I wonder who supported that, Now, when the administration talks about the Sunnis and the Shiites and the Kurds, they mean their Sunnis and their Shiites and their Kurds, right? They're friends who they ended up supporting to be in the executive branch. So when anyone asks anyone from the administration, how come you're not pulling out from Iraq? They say, no, look, the Sunnis and the Shiites and the Kurds want us there. You want a proof? We'll bring you one Sunni and one Shiite. They can say that, They bring their own employees from the green zone, and they say, yeah, we love thank you for liberating us. They go back home. Now, we never hear what the Iraqi legislative branch says, because that's inconvenient. What the Iraqi democracy has brought to power is inconvenient. The same way that the Palestinian democracy brought to power a very big inconveniency. The same way that the Iranian democracy brought to power a very big, and in fact small, inconveniency. All of these democratic experiences in the Middle East, they don't get acknowledged by the US government just because they had elections. It's usually more conditional. The US government supports any election that will end up being compatible to the US foreign policy's goals in that region. If it wasn't, who cares about democracy? If it was, we love democracy. So now where we stand now, back to my point, the split in the Iraqi government, there are some Sunnis, some Shiites, some Kurds in the executive branch who are for partitioning, for the occupation to continue, and for privatizing Iraq's oil, passing the oil law that was written in Washington, D.C. I'm not kidding, it was actually written. There is a company called Bearing Point in Virginia that wrote the oil law. Now the other Sunnis and the other Shiites and the other Kurds and Christians and Turkmen in the legislative branch, they don't want partitioning, they don't want to continue the occupation, and they don't want to privatize Iraq's natural resources. Now what happened in Basra, according to the US narrative, is a mystery, right? After 5 years of telling us that Sunnis hate Shiites and Shiites hate Sunnis, and the government is attacking terrorists and the terrorists are attacking the government, we reached to Basra, and then two Shiite groups who are in the government attack another two Shiite groups who are in the government as well. So that sounds very weird, right? It doesn't seem like there is an explanation to that. But from an Iraqi perspective, it makes so much sense. Of course they will attack them. Of course the Shiites in the executive branch, who are supported by the US, will attack the Shiites in the legislative branch, who are against the occupation. In fact, the real reason for the clashes that happened in Basra were not that someone wanted to attack militias, outlaws, or whatever they were calling them. There are 28 different militias in Iraq. Most of them supported and trained and sometimes paid directly by the US. If the US is against militias, they shouldn't be creating more militias. The real reason for the conflict is that the next elections will happen in October, and the Iraqi parliament passed a resolution for a law, a new law, that is called the provincial law. Now, this law will decide what the future of the country will look like. Whether Iraq will continue to be provinces that follows one central government, or whether Iraq will partition. So whomever wins the next provincial elections will have the city. If the separatists won 3 at least of the provinces in the south, for example, they will decide to have their own little government, their own army, their own flag, everything, secede from the center. If the separatists fell, if they